Do please take a seat. And a good evening. It's great to see you this evening. If you've got Psalm 9 open in front of you, that'll be a great help to you and I this evening. Let me pray for us as we get into this. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the truths we've just sung. We thank you that you are our rock, our refuge, our Redeemer, that you are the exalted and faithful King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And as Graham prayed earlier, you speak through your words, you rule over us through your words. So help us listen well to your words this evening for our good and for your glory. Amen. I wonder if you've ever done that thing when you're planning a holiday and maybe you find that location which you'd like to go to. And so what you do is you go on Google Maps and you type in the destination, the address, the postcode, whatever it is, and it zooms you right in. And there it is. That's sort of where you're looking. And then what do? What's your next move? Well, you then start to zoom out, don't you? Because what you really want to know is, well, where is this place in relation to other places? Like actually, how far away is the airport? Is it close to a beach? Where's a big city maybe that's worth visiting nearby? Are there shops? Are there things to do? You can lose a few hours, can't you, I imagine? Kind of searching around, trying to get your bearings as to where does this place, where does my place fit in relation to all the other places around it. I want to suggest to you this evening that in some ways the Psalms work a little bit like that for us. The Psalms help us get our bearings. They help us look at your place. You take that this is the place I am, and kind of zoom out and get your bearings as to how does my place, my situation fit with all of the other things, all of the other bigger realities all around me. Psalm 9 begins with the heading, and if you weren't aware, it's worth knowing the little kind of subheadings you get into the Psalms, they're part of the original text, so we want to listen to those. And it starts with this: it's for the director of music, to the tune of the death of a son, or the death of the son, a psalm of David. We don't know exactly the historical background to when it was written, but a number of commentators think that it's possible that it was written sort of in the wake of the death of David's son Absalom. Absalom had sadly led an uprising, a coup, against his own father, David, and David had to flee far away, and thankfully for David, the uprising was put down, and Absalom was put to death, but David was heartbroken. And so there's a sense as you read the psalm, David is praising God, that God's justice prevails, but not in a sort of a glib, triumphalistic, shallow way, with that sense of sort of praise that God's justice prevails, but still real about kind of the hurt and the pain of his situation. And I think you get a sense of that from the psalm. I'm not really into giving titles to talks, but if I were to do it for this one, I think the title that I would give to the talk on Psalm 9 would be this: the immortal God of justice who blots out evil. That's what the psalm is about. It's about the immortal God of justice who blots out evil. And I hope by the time we get to the end of it, you'll see why. I think that's a good way of describing the psalm. I've just got two headings for us this evening as David walks through this, and then just a thought about how we kind of respond and read. So our first heading this evening is this. Here's what David is doing. In some ways, the large part of what he's doing in the psalm is this: remember who God is. When you find yourself thrown kind of life's curveballs, whatever may come, always remember who God is in the midst of all of that. And so David says a number of things in the psalm about God. He says 3 times God is enthroned. He is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And so in verse 4, he says, you have upheld my right and my cause, sitting enthroned as the righteous judge. Or in verse 7, the Lord reigns forever and has established his throne of judgment. Or verse 11, sing the praises of the Lord enthroned in Zion 3 times. Whatever the other world's kind of kings, lords, rulers are, God is the one who's truly enthroned above all. And unlike all of the other rulers of the world, his rule is eternal, verse 7. Do you see that there? The Lord reigns forever. Every human ruler's time comes to an end. Even the longest of human rulers might make it to as much as 70 years, but they will die. Their rule will finish. Not so with God. He reigns forever. While all the other rulers of all the other nations, they come and they go, God reigns, and he reigns forever. And in his rule, he's not kind of distant, he's not far off, he's not sort of twiddling his thumbs, wondering what might be happening to his subjects. He knows all, and he sees all. Verse 12, we're told, he who avenges blood, he remembers. He does not ignore the cries of the afflicted. Or in verse 18, God will never forget the needy. The hope of the afflicted will never perish. There's nothing he doesn't see. There's nothing he doesn't know. There's nothing in your life, circumstance, or situation which catches God by surprise, as if he wasn't aware of it. God is like to his creation. He's like Shakespeare to one of Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare knows the beginning from the end. He wrote the entire story. He created all of the characters. He knows every moment of it. He can access every moment of it as its author. God is like, have you ever done that thing, parents with kids, where when you're trying to teach your child to ride a bike, you hold on to the seat, don't you? And as they start to pedal, you run along behind, kind of holding on to make sure they don't fall over. And if they build up enough speed, then you let go. At some point, you let go, mainly because your back is killing, isn't it? If you're kind of bending down, running along like that, you can't do it for long. And you let them go, and you hope and pray that they'll keep it going. But often, it takes a few goes, doesn't it? There's a few spills along the way. God never lets go. God never lets go. There's never any point where he lets go and says, well, I hope you're okay. Hope it works out for you. No, he's always there. It's reckoned that through the course of human history, there have been something like 50 to 70 major global empires. In Britain, over the last 1,200 years, we've seen 63 different monarchs. Today, there are something like 195 nations, each with their own ruler. Over the course of human history, it's estimated there have been something like 10,000 wars. There are 40 of them ongoing today in the world. And in the last 100 years, there have been 150 coups, military coups. None of that will ever happen to God. He outlives and outlasts every ruler. He is sovereign over each person and each place and each time. Nothing ever catches him out. Remarkably, even though he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords over the whole thing, it's then remarkable, isn't it, when Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. Even the very hairs of your heads are all numbered." The eternal and immortal King over the nations and over time itself knows all, right down to the number of hairs on your heads. That's how great he is. And David is kind of starting here, isn't he? As David is kind of working out the situation around him and his own grief and perhaps his own relief, he says, well, there is a king. There is a God who is high over all, the eternal, infinite, immortal, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, all-wise God who is ordering everything in accordance with his good purposes. Though the nations rage, kingdoms rise and fall, there is still one king reigning over all. Remember who God is, says David, as you're getting your bearings in the world, in your place. But secondly, remember what God does. Remember who he is. Remember what he does. And the most repeated word in the psalm is the Hebrew word that is translated both as justice or judgment or righteousness. It's the same word translated slightly differently. But we see it in verse 4. You have upheld my right and my cause, sitting enthroned as the righteous judge. Verse 8, he rules the world in righteousness and judges the people with equity. Verse 16, the Lord is known by his acts of justice. Verse 19, arise, Lord, do not let mortals triumph. Let the nations be judged in your presence. God, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, always acts in accordance with justice. He does justly. And that means one of two things, doesn't it? It means for the wicked, the sobering thing here, it means destruction. So we see that, don't we, in verse 5, those who oppose God and his people. Verse 5, you have rebuked the nations and destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. Verse 12, he who avenges blood. In other words, he who does justice. Or verse 17, the wicked go down to the realm of the dead. All the nations that forget God. Justice for those who rebel against God, those who trample his people, actually will ultimately mean destruction. I think David includes here, not just in this life. We don't always see it in this life, but he says they will go down to the realm of the dead. Justice will catch up with them. Nobody will be able to refuse to attend their sentencing before God. No one will be able to say, no, I'm going to stay in the cells and I don't want to face my judge and I don't want to hear it, I'm not coming. Nobody will be able to do that. Everyone will have to stand. Everyone will have to appear. And those who have rebelled against God will face his judgment. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each of us may receive what is due. For God's people, for those that seek him, that means in him acting for us, he is our refuge. Verse 9 and 10, the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Those who know your name trust in you. For you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. If you go to a place called Kelvedon Hatch in Brentwood in Essex, as you approach, there's a visitor centre there now. What you'll see as you get there is essentially what looks like a fairly ordinary bungalow on some farmland. But what's actually there is this. In the early 50s, the government bought the land and the bungalow, and they dug a tunnel out the back of the bungalow. The tunnel goes for 120 yards down and into the hillside behind the bungalow. And what's there, if you get to the end of the tunnel, is a nuclear bunker. It was built in 1952 with the threat of potential Cold War. And the walls are 10 foot thick. The doors each weigh 1.5 tons. The idea being was that 600 people could survive in there for 3 months if, in the event that a nuclear bomb was ever dropped. Thankfully, it was never needed. But God is that sort of refuge for his people. He is that sort of stronghold, that sort of security. That means no force of evil can ever get to us, such as his protection. And he remembers our plight. You pick that up twice. It says the same thing, verse 12. He does not ignore the cries of the afflicted. And in verse 18, God will never forget the needy. The hope of the afflicted will never perish. God does not forget us. I walk into a room now and sometimes forget why I walked into the room. I have to, why do I come in here again? I have to write down lists so I remember, so I don't forget to do things. I don't know if any of you are forgetful. I even heard of somebody, a member of this church, who once left their own baby at the swimming pool reception and drove home. And only realised when they got home they'd left the baby and had to go back. If you come up afterwards, I might tell you who they are. I might have forgotten by then. It's entirely possible. God never forgets. He never forgets. He's never caught by surprise. He never has one of those absent-minded moments where he forgets your situation and has to catch himself up. He's always mindful. He always remembers what his people are going through. We may not always see the answers to all of our prayers in this life, but that doesn't mean God isn't listening or that he isn't there. He always remembers. the wonderful invitations there, isn't it, in verse 10? The Lord never forsakes those who seek him. And Jesus said these words in John's Gospel, whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. Whoever comes to him, whoever seeks him, he never drives away. And whoever comes to him, never seeks him, he never forsakes. That's the invitation. The warning here is that every knee will ultimately bow. We see that in verse 16. The Lord is known by his acts of justice. In other words, the Lord will be known. He will ultimately be known. And in verse 20 here, where it says, strike them with terror, Lord. Let the nations know they are only mortal. The lordship of God, his kingship, will ultimately be known by everybody. Everybody will bow the knee before God's. Now, the option you have is whether you do it in this life or whether you do it in the next and ultimately face judgment. But every knee will bow. Every knee will know and acknowledge his justice. That's what David's saying, Psalm 9, as he's reflecting on the death of his son. There's a certain pain that comes with that, but also a certain praise at God's ultimate justice. And the thing that he keeps coming back to is this sense of getting your bearings means remembering who God is and remember what God does. And that helps you work out how to live where you are. How do you respond to this? Well, there's two things really that the Psalm's interesting for, isn't it? In the sort of preserving of this for subsequent generations. The responses that we see in David are praise and prayer. So in verses 1 to 2, it begins with praise. I will give thanks to you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing the praises of your name most high. And then he calls the people to do it in verse 11. Sing the praise of the Lord, enthroned in Zion. Proclaim among the nations what he has done. He's calling others to praise. And then he finishes with prayer. Verse 19, arise, Lord. Don't let the mortals triumph. Praise and prayer. It's important, isn't it, that the Psalms help us do this. The Psalms teach us that our response to what we know about God is critically important for us learning, for our praise, for our worship, for our experience of this. There's something here that says the expression of praise helps us to embed it. If you like, embodying is embedding. Embodying worship is embedding worship. It is as we give voice to our prayer and to our praise and our prayer that we learn what it means. It's a bit like learning scales. If you learn a musical instrument and you have to learn scales. Or a bit like the bike. You learn to ride a bike or you learn to drive a car. There are some things, you do them until you can do them. Praise and worship is a bit like that. You do them until you can do them. And this side of heaven, we're still learning and we're still practicing. That means for us, actually, as a church, when we come together like this, one day in 7, morning and evening as the rhythm, actually our sung worship is as important as our receiving of a sermon. The reception of the word is important, but then the expression of praise and prayer is equally important. It's not that one bit kind of fills some time while we wait for the main event. It's actually we need both. We need to receive and we need to express if we're to learn what it means to respond to the truth about God in the place he has put us. A couple of final things, thoughts in terms of how we read. As Christians, we read from a slightly different place. We read as those who we know Jesus has come, and we know Jesus told us that he was the fulfillment of everything that the Old Testament was sort of working towards. So we read the psalm in light of that. We read the psalm in the light of the coming of Christ. And so the title is interesting, isn't it? What was the title again? The death of the Son. The death of the Son. What's interesting about this psalm is here's the test if you're listening well to this. If God really acts justly and judges the people with equity, What does that mean for me? Because I haven't lived a perfect life, and I've got plenty of unjust and bad things in my life. So if God is really going to deal with me justly, what does that mean for me? The good news is Jesus comes to address exactly that problem. We see some of the hints of it here, don't we? At verse 5, have a look down again. We're told that God has blotted out the name of the wicked forever. But in the New Testament, we read that God has blotted out our sin forever. He became sin to bear sin, or the punishment for sin, so that we don't have to. So that now actually my sin is blotted out because of Jesus, so that I don't have to be. We're told in verse 10 that God never forsakes those who seek him. How so? Because the Son was forsaken in my place. My God, why have you forsaken me? Well, exactly so that he doesn't have to forsake me. He bears the full weight of God's justice against evil in my place, so that I'm never forsaken. He is the one that goes to the gates of death, who goes down to the realm of dead. He is the one that doesn't stay there. Verse 19, arise, Lord, and so he did. He rose, so that death did not have the final words. And so one more way to read that, think of perhaps the death of any son or daughter of King Jesus. The death of any son or daughter is in fact not an end, but a beginning. It's not a fearful thing, but it's a wonderful start. It is to be lamented. It is painful, but it's also glorious. We are not forsaken. We are not abandoned to the gates of death. We are not abandoned to the realm of the dead. But in fact, we too will arise. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, because the mortal must clothe itself with immortality. Hence the title that I would give to the talk if I were to give titles to talks. The immortal God of justice blots out evil. The immortal King of justice blots out evil. Which means that refuge spoken of in the psalm is a necessity for us. It's an invitation to us. It's a promise for us. As we're going to sing in a minute of our King Jesus, none above him, none before him, all of time in his hands. For his throne it shall remain and ever stand. All the power, all the glory, I will trust in his name. For my God is the Ancient of Days.